Good afternoon. Welcome back to Pagitt Radio, hour 2 of our January 22nd conversation. Hey, little rascals. We've got our friend Philip Clayton on the line. Philip is a doctor, a professor, a dean of some very fancy things going on at Claremont School of Theology out in Claremont.
Is he an Indian
California.
chief as well?
He's an Indian chief and does many things and has a terrific magic act.
Oh, really?
To bar mitzvahs and birthday parties and so on. Philip, thanks for being on the radio show, and thanks so much for doing what you can, what you've done to help Claremont School of Theology host the Emergent Village Theological Conversation happening next Tuesday out there at your wonderful institution.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show. And I've never been a part of the Progressive Voice of Minnesota before.
Is that, well, this is the
Welcome.
Progressive Voice of Minnesota station, and you happen to be on America's most listened to progressive religious talk radio on the internet and in cars and on smartphones and maybe in the internet.
I knew you needed a chance to say that, Doug.
Yeah, thanks for the beautiful setup. We found out that there's a radio show in Canada that refers to themselves as Canada's most listened to spiritual talk station. And we've said we're gunning at them.
We're not going to be outdone by a bunch of Canucks.
We're going to run at them like Newt Gingrich.
Yeah.
We're going to make a Newt run right at them. Hey, Philip, this conversation that's going to go on next week out at the Claremont School of Theology and in conversation with Emergent Village, it involves a conversation around process theology. And for those who aren't familiar with this notion of process theology, give us the professorial snapshot.
Well, I think there's a boring way to approach process theology, and there's an interesting way. The boring way is to say there was a white dude who lived in the beginning of the 20th century and wrote impenetrable books with names like Process and Reality, which Whitehead did publish in 1927. And you got to memorize those terms, most of which have never are incomprehensible even to experts.
Right.
And if you know them, then you're closer to God, and we'll call you a process theologian.
Oh,
Yes, nice.
Now, the interesting way to approach
Dr.
process
Clayton.
theology would be to turn it backwards and to say it's any theology that recognizes thought about God is always in progress, and nobody gets to call the final shot.
Well, that's
And so I
interesting.
like to think of process theology in that way.
Yeah, I do too. And that's interesting because the sidekick here on the show was talking about this conversation with another professional theologian this week. And he kept mistakenly referring to it as progress theology. And I think he might have been onto something in his sort of simple way. Right? That he was saying what it's about is that there's some kind of progress, there's some kind of happening, there's some kind of development going on in this theological system.
I mean, it's one thing which a lot of people today say, you know, nobody gets to say the final word about God. It's a lot harder than we thought 100 years ago. Conservative Christians don't have it wrapped up, but nor do liberal Christians, nor do Jews or Muslims or whatever. But it would be more radical and interesting if you said, no, it's not just that we're not very smart. You know, we're infinitely shorter than whatever the divine nature is. But what if God, in God's own experience, is developing or progressing or really responding to the experiences of humans and of the world and presumably the universe? So I like to think of process theology as the claim that God takes relationship with humanity so seriously that God is actually affected in God's own nature, experiences new things through what we think, say, and do, and really relates to us. I mean, imagine if when I married my partner 15 years ago, that she hadn't changed an inch since those 15 years. I had no new experiences, no new thoughts, and no new responses. I don't think I'd feel particularly loved. Likewise with God.
Okay, wait a minute, Dr. Clayton. Now, doesn't the Bible say that that God is unchanging, and in Him there is no shadow of turning? So why all of us isn't this just kind of convenient to match whatever we want God to be?
Okay, that's a brilliant question, and it led process theologians put him in front of a really difficult decision. If they said God is totally changing and can go anywhere and become anything, then you couldn't count on God. You're like, what if God goes over to the dark side, Luke? Right?
Yeah, right. I've seen that movie.
I am your father. But so they said, think that there are two poles in God, two sides, that God's nature, being, is eternal. The values, the qualities, in God never change. That addresses that biblical passage that you just mentioned. But God's experience, what they call the consequent nature of God in process theology, God's experience is constantly developing in response to every human being, and in fact, every living thing on this planet.
You know, I actually didn't hear anything you said after you said I was brilliant.
He stopped right at a brilliant question and thought, once again. So Philip, tell us this. Who's really bothered by this notion of progress in theology and this understanding that we should think about God's experience as being meaningful as opposed to God being above all things and sort of removed from effect by anything that were to happen in the world or to humanity? Who's really... Like you're a professional theologian, right? You're someone who runs in a lot of circles and you teach students, but you also move in the guild of the professional theologians in the world. So I'm thinking you have a different perspective on this. Who's really wigged out when they hear this kind of thing talked about?
You know, two groups of people are wigged out by the idea that God might actually be responding to the world and developing in God's experience. And the one is going to be, this hurts, the professional theologians. Because if God is static, then we can get him right, and we can stay in our positions of power, and folks have to come to us to find out.
Nice.
The other group would be those who think that the essence of religion was spelled out, let's say, 2,000 years ago, and it's not allowed to change in any respect, that one book holds absolutely the timeless truths, and if you can just find the right proof text, you know what God's thinking right now.
You know, this reminds me of something. We did a conversation over Christmas with our good friends from the Minnesota Atheists Association and the Minnesota Humanists Association, and we had a 2-hour conversation on Christianity and science and atheism and so on, and religion as a whole. And it was interesting because I hold a very similar view to what you hold, not only about how we should think about God, but how we think about thinking about God, right? So that we should think about it, and history has shown us that over time, people have developed varying perspectives, understandings, and conclusions about God. And it's a very dynamic field of the last 5,000 years of recorded human history about how people have thought about God. And it was interesting because my friends there from the Minnesota Atheists Association and Humanists were saying, hey, no, you don't get to do that. Like, there are things that are just Christian theology about God, and when you guys come around and gals come around and start saying, no, well, people don't actually think that way about it anymore, it kind of changes the rules. And it's really hard to have a conversation when you guys are saying, well, we don't think that way anymore, but I know people used to, but we really don't think that way anymore.
Doug, that's really interesting because in the debates with the new atheists, they get apoplectic when I say, well, what if there's a responsive, evolving God? Because if you look at the actual quotes in Dawkins' God Delusion, or it's in Christopher Hitchens, and it's also even in Sam Harris, they'll say religion is, saying you know exactly who God is and God never changes and God's all-powerful. And if you say, well, that's not what a lot of actual religious people believe, they'll say, no, that's not fair. You can't change the rules.
You can't change that. That's what I mean. And I think that I don't think that I think they're right about that, right? Like, they're right that for a long time people were saying the thing religion brings is an unchanging system. And then I think people like us are now saying, well, I don't know that that was ever accurate, and I don't think we want it to be accurate. So we really are changing the rules on those poor folks. And so it's interesting that I felt the same pressure. Maybe you have too, because I know you've done many more of those conversations with your friends from that perspective than I have. But it's interesting how it sounds like the conversations I have with my religious fundamentalist friends who will say, you can't just create God in your own image, and that's what I think you're doing. And then I try to say and you say better, I think I'm created in God's image, not I'm doing it the other way around, and I'm changing.
The great irony of that response is that the Bible shows a God who's responding to people.
Right.
In Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, there's a God who's genuinely interacting with humanity. That's what's so beautiful about this biblical perspective. Isn't it interesting that the people who claim to value the Bible most highly give us a static God who can't change in any respect? That's a great irony.
Yeah, it is. And I think that we're really fighting an uphill battle. And I know that in Christianity, at least, in the Christian subset of religious expression, I've had to make a decision. And I'm interested here after the break how you've thought about this, because I had to sort of decide at one point, do I want to akin myself with the Christian tradition as my family, or should I just say, okay, look, Christianity really has been expressed in that unchanging paradigm, and now I'm doing something else over here that I can call sort of some kind of new Jesus following, or come up with some other category. And I've decided to stay part of the family.
And I'm going to say, Doug, it only gets interesting when process theology meets emergent church.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, we have less than a minute for this segment, but play that out a little bit. What is it that you think makes that interesting?
What's happening in this national discussion on Tuesday is that this process theology stuff we've been talking about meets a group of people who are willing to think the church in radically new terms that break the old rules. And if those two got together, there'd be a powerhouse like you've never seen before.
Well, that's I've thought the same thing. Like, if you don't have, because human beings don't think about their philosophies and theologies outside of lived experience, and you have to have communities of lived experience. So I want to chat with you a little bit about that. And if people are interested, you can connect to this event at emergentvillage.com. It's going to be taking place. It's $100 for a couple of days together. A number of people. We'll put the link up on the Facebook page for Doug Pagitt Radio, and you can find the link there if you want to come and be part of the event. And Philip, can you hold on and be with us for another segment?
Sure can.
Great. So stick with us here. We're going to chat a little bit about this event and about this kind of development in spirituality, theology, and even in Christian thought. Doug Pagitt Radio on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and DougPagittRadio.com.